Defense spending is a major line item in the 2025 federal budget. Prime Minister Mark Carney has pledged to hit a NATO target of 2% of GDP this year and 5% by 2035. Does this sizable investment make sense? And what kind of difference will it make for our armed forces? I asked Richard Shamuka, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute and contributing writer at The Hub, and Stephanie Carvin, Associate Professor at Carleton University. Richard, Stephanie, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for making time. Richard, I'm going to start with you. This marks 80 years since the end of World War II. Does warfare today look anything like it looked to the Canadian soldiers who fought back then?
I mean, if you just think about the parallel in our day-to-day lives, right? Mm-hmm. In some ways, warfare just kind of reflects how societies, technologies, and all that kind of sort of improve over generations, and certainly our lives are completely different today, and warfare is no different. You think some of the major developments in, let's say, telecommunications, like phones, right? Like back then, the decision-making cycle, the decision to make, we're going to bomb something, may take a week or so. And much like if you had a decision in business would take, something like that to kind of bring all together information. And then today it's done within minutes or even seconds to some degree of the identification of a target and all that. At the same time, some of the sort of core strengths or ideas that you think about how, what Canadians are strong with, which is ingenuity and sort of how we operate on our daily lives, is still reflected in the military. So that, it's a challenge, but we have a new technological and societal kind of backdrop, and that's how a war is affected. And so many of the core values, the ideas, the intents exist, but the technology environment, the military environment is completely different.
Well, let's pick up on that, Stephanie. What advancements or technologies would you say have changed the game the most?
Well, I think indisputably, if we're talking since 1945, it's nuclear weapons, right? Nuclear weapons have really had a huge impact on the way we think about warfare, on the strategy of warfare. And to a certain extent, with the advent of these nuclear weapons, a lot of the aim now is to deter force as opposed to use force. And, the threat of violence is really kind of latent in the sense that, you're basically threatening massive retaliation if you do something that we don't like, as opposed to, actually having to go and use force and then stop once you agree to our terms. So I think that's been a large part of that. But at the same time, we have also seen advancements in other kinds. It's not like there hasn't been war since 1945. There obviously has been. And a lot of them have been very different in the sense that they are conflicts that are between states and non-state actors. We had, of course, the wars of decolonization in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And, in those cases, you had armies that had tremendous amounts of lethality, like large numbers of troops, and struggled against kind of ragtag groups of, right, well-organized, well-motivated, forces that were nevertheless also supported by states, but were able to inflict enough cost that these large militaries were unable to go forward. So it shows that, technology isn't always the answer. It's the way, and I think this was, very much a part of Richard's answer, your ability to make those decisions quickly, to kind of integrate those technologies into how you think, but also your ability to win hearts and minds, which is a part of this kind of information warfare, which is also rapidly changing the way, states have to think about armed conflict.
So with that, Richard, what does a military need to do in order to adapt and keep up with the times when we talk about technology specifically?
The critical is flexibility. I mean, you think about the rapidity of how our technology change is occurring right now, right? You think about in the space of sort of bioethics or biotechnology, right? That's an area where you see rapid development in sort of new novel forms of pathogens and areas, and that's the military has to keep focus on this because that's a potential vector that one of our adversaries may use. It's a niche area certainly, but it's just one of many. You think about AI right now, just the difficulty that governments and our societies are trying to deal with this absolutely novel form of technology that really didn't exist in maybe a decade and a half ago. And the military is viewed as basically being the new commanding heights in the sense that if we are not on the cutting edge of this, at least to understand its effects and its possibilities, then one of our adversaries like China, which is a huge investor in this field, we may fall behind. So certainly the ability to be flexible, to have this sort of reservoir of knowledge within the department or the military itself to identify what are the trends, what are the things we need to watch, and what are the things we need to avoid. Those are the kind of critical areas of flexibility that I think you will see within the department, within everywhere else that are absolutely required.
Stephanie, what kind of capabilities do other militaries have that the Canadian Armed Forces don't?
It's a really interesting question. And some level, it actually kind of gets down to bullets, right? Like we've heard stories that, Canadian Armed Forces haven't been able to train with bullets because there's an ammunition shortage. So that's kind of some of the level that we're dealing with right now. And we can get to that maybe more in the budget part of the conversation. But I think to a large extent that it's not, we have really some really advanced capabilities. We saw the Canadian Armed Forces just recently start up a cyber command. I think it's CAF Cybercom. We have space-based abilities, although we're looking to enhance them. And we have really good capabilities in the Arctic and certain capabilities up there that, even our NATO allies are interested in and are working with us on developing further. So, so it's not to say we don't have capabilities, but one of the things that I think that the Canadian Armed Forces is looking at right now is how warfare has been changing, particularly in the last even just 3 to 4 years. They're looking at the lessons of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? And they're seeing how quickly adaptation takes place. The challenges that both sides are really having in terms of manpower and how to integrate force and technology together in order to basically survive in the case of Ukraine, or just simply some of the brutality that still continues to exist. If we think back to the Syrian conflict in over the last 10 years, which is thankfully largely resolved, although there's still some fighting in that region. But I mean, the Russian armed forces were using barrel bombs, which are just simply metal containers full of junk dropped at large heights with dynamite and cause huge immeasurable suffering. So this isn't exactly an advanced technology, but it is a willingness to use brutal force on civilian populations that has definitely been a character of the wars we've been seeing in over the last couple of years, whether it's in Sudan, Ukraine, Gaza, anywhere.
Richard, in August, the Canadian Army put out a policy proposal about modernizing the force. They said in that document, the Army we have is not the Army we need. Can you describe the gaps that exist between the Army we have and the Army we need?
Oh, it's manifold. I mean, there's so, to some degree, you have to remember that most of our allies had starting a major modernization cycle around 2014, 2015, and that kind of aligns with the Wales Summit, the NATO Wales Summit, where that was where the 2% guidelines were first instituted. And since then, they have sort of viewed what's gone on in Ukraine, to Stephanie's great point, and also in other conflicts to identify, well, what are these major trends, right? And where can we go from here to sort of deal with, to address those issues? So, for example, in the Army specifically, air defense is seen as absolutely vital enabler. We watch today what goes on in Ukraine with just the amount of drones that they've really taken up a huge part of sort of the Army's sort of existing capabilities. It's not a replacement, but it's certainly a supplement, let's say, for long range artillery. For the ability to sort of identify targets through reconnaissance is probably the most important development in this area. And so air defense systems are absolutely vital to ensure that armies can remain protected, able to be mobile and sort of undertake operations. Canadian military has identified and bought a small number of systems, but it's nowhere near the sort of comprehensive systems that our allies have brought in. We don't have any real effective long-range artillery. Our tanks are starting to get old. We don't have many because we've actually donated a fair few to Ukraine. And I can keep on and on and on. But the one part that I think is really lacking that really needs to be addressed and accelerated further is so the networking component. Because just like in our society today, as I mentioned before, we think about how phones and sort of other sort of social media systems sort of bind us and make us more effective in a lot of our work. The military has really been slow to adopt this because of those funding cutbacks. And that's a real core area that we need to address and move forward.
All right, you talk funding, let's talk budget. The Liberal government's budget laid out more than $80 billion over the next 5 years to rearm and reinvest in the military. There is money set aside for recruitment and retention, for infrastructure and training, and for new equipment. Stephanie, we know that we want a line there for bullets, but what else do you want to see the money go to?
Well, one of the most interesting things that is in the budget is that of that 84 billion, 25% is actually earmarked just simply for raises, right? Just paying people to get to, who have joined the armed forces, improving their salary, and hopefully that will help improve recruitment and retainment. And I think that's a good thing overall. I mean, we want our soldiers to be well paid because they are in many ways making sacrifices that many of us in the civilian world aren't making on a regular basis. So I think that's a very good thing. There's another, I think, $18 billion that's aimed at some of the weapons that, Richard was just mentioning. And, if we look at the document that the Army has been putting out, they've identified a number of those capabilities that they need, just things to help them just do better war fighting generally, right? So things like better precision, becoming harder to detect, deny. I think, that's part of the lessons of Ukraine for sure. Being able to target better, target faster. I think that's a large part of it. They've also identified the need to engage in long range capabilities. So a lot of that kind of long range precision is a part of that $18 billion. And then finally, kind of long term, I don't think this is in the $84 billion, but it is in the budget generally, is the ability to, help develop the Arctic, right? If you want to be up there, you need strong, safe, healthy communities in the Arctic. And so having things like roads that exist year round is going to be very important, particularly if you're going to emphasize the Army and military's ability to have persistence in the north. So just simply building up those capabilities so we can put numbers of people up there in the Arctic. And in this document, all the recent documents, whether defense policy update or the inflection point 2025 Army document, really are emphasizing the Arctic as a central area of importance in the future.
Richard, I want to get your take on that as well, but overall, what do you make of the budget's plans for defense spending?
I think it's maybe the first initial blueprint, to use some of their language, but I think it still requires a lot more detail to actually get a full appreciation of what it may entail. And I also, as a general view, because we've been so delayed on the actual modernization vis-a-vis our allies, we probably need more investment or significantly more investment. The problem is there's just not enough capacity within the department to actually execute on some of these ambitions. So it has definitely has great rundown of those aspects. The only one area that I'd probably add might be is that there is $6.6 billion for the Defense Industrial Base of Canada, an area that in order to sort of, let's say, get the munitions, get the ships and whatnot that are required to sort of execute on the broad policy ambition is really required. And even there, I would argue that there's just not enough amount. The other one aspect that I think is important to view is that a lot of this was put into a 5-year time frame, and we don't know about exactly the details and also the sequencing. Is it going to be backloaded like a lot of other previous policy documents or budgets, or is it front loaded or evenly distributed? Those are big questions. So we need to see a bit more, would be my thought, and we probably need to spend more as well.
Yeah, and if I could just complement that point, I would just say that, the word submarine doesn't really appear in the budget, right? So we know that's something that's coming, that's a decision down the road. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't exactly call it's a blueprint, but like, the faintest of blue. There's a lot
Right.
more detail that's going to have to come out in the next couple of years. But I think that clearly the military is seeing this as a generational opportunity, and hopefully we will see that plan come to fruition. A friend of mine put it recently. It's like it's as if the government has invited the military to go to the buffet, but not given them any dietary restrictions. And so we're going to have to wait to see how that works out.
All right, Richard. Some have said the budget strategy seems to have two purposes: rearming the Canadian military, and at the same time, economically developing the Canadian defense industry. On paper, some people might look at that and be like, "Hey, that's really good. 2 for 1 right there." Is that the right strategy?
I think it carries a fair bit of risk, and I'd say the Minister of Finance's comments just after the budget, where he says it has to support Canadian economy, I think is kind of reflects the potential risks of it. Frankly, if you look at defense industries in most other countries, it's subservient to defense policy. It is a direct line towards it. And one of the ironies is that Canada actually exports about as much as it produces for its own domestic utility, right, in the defense industry. So we actually have a highly globalized industry. But the reality is that the Canadian forces have basically been starved for 20, if not 30 years of some pretty critical investments. And if you start sort of diverting to look towards, oh, what can we get the most for the domestic benefit of Canada without actually addressing those arguably the most fundamental concern that government has in terms of its foreign policy or its sovereignty, you are not going to get the bang for your buck. You may actually get less capability at much higher costs, right? And just not even you wouldn't get the great economic output because it's not really hinged on what the forces needs, right? And what would be sustainable in the long term, because you're just kind of making economic bets rather than actually sustained bets on what is required for the national sovereignty of the country.
Stephanie, you get the last word on this. 30 seconds. Is this the right strategy?
It's hard to say because just simply we don't have enough detail yet, right? And, we've spent a lot of time talking about defense. We're also waiting on national security strategy, which will be coming out hopefully sometime this year or early next year. We've been waiting for one now for 4 years. So what the vision of defense is going to be for this country is going to be really, really important. And, Richard's talked about all these important aspects of, the defense industrial base, but we also are now faced with the decision of, well, how close do we want to be with the United States? Interoperability. We're going to be part of this golden dome, which is not an actual dome, of course. It's going to be several military systems about missile defense. But, these are some really important decisions. And Canadians have some very strong feelings about, who our allies are right now. And so how the government navigates this on top of all the procurements that we're going to be making is going to be something I will be paying very close attention to over the next couple of months.
We are going to leave it there. Stephanie, Richard, it looks like we're going to have this conversation in a few months' time. So looking forward to it. And thank you for your insights.
Thank you.